Good evening. Welcome to the United Church of Stratford, Vermont, to this first event in our speaker series entitled Election 2024, What is at Stake? Welcome to those of you who are in the sanctuary. Welcome to you online. And welcome viewers on JAM, Junction Arts and Art and Media's televised broadcast. My name is Tom Kinder, and I am the pastor of this church. We always begin by acknowledging that we are on the ancestral and unceded land of the traditional caretakers, the Western Abenaki or Wabanaki people. And part of our stewardship of this land is to govern the society that inhabits it responsibly. And that means, in part, being well-informed and actively engaged in electoral politics. We are hosting this series in our church sanctuary because we believe that this is a sacred duty. And our choices need to be made in the context of our highest ethical values and philosophical ideals. This is in no way a religious event, though. You may relax. We have no agenda other than our two stated goals. First, to educate ourselves about what is at stake in the November 5th, 2024 election in a variety of issue areas. And second, to inspire ourselves to become active and devote time and resources to help elect candidates who are more aligned with the nation and world we each want to create, whoever those candidates may be. We intend, here's another anxiety reducer, we intend to abide well within the IRS requirements for a church, which means that we will not directly or indirectly endorse or oppose any candidate. We have asked all the speakers in this series to make clear the difference between the two major parties and their candidates on one particular set of issues, based on what the parties and candidates have done in the past and what they have said about their future intentions. So whatever your perspective, we welcome you here. And this church aspires to be a safe place where people of differing views will regard one another with respect, with compassion, with care, where we will listen deeply to understand the other person's perspective, even if we do not share it. We will have a question and answer period in this event, and we ask that during that time you not criticize, you not debate argumentatively or attack, but just simply state your own views and know that they will be honored with the same respect that you give to others. Now, this is not to say that we cannot feel strong emotions and passions and passionate concerns, because of course we will. But it is asked to aim that we aim those passions toward issues and principles and values and ideals, and not turn them against other people. Please remember that we are here because we all share what our neighbor William Sloane Coffin called a passion for the possible. We are here because we all want a nation that fulfills its highest ideals and is a blessing to its people and to the world. Bill Coffin would also remind us that we have far more in common than we ever have in conflict. So let us put our hearts and minds together this evening as one for the good of all. And now it is my honor and deep pleasure to introduce our presenter and teacher, Rod Smolla, president of the Vermont Law and Graduate School and a lifelong constitutional constitutional law scholar, teacher, and litigator. It's been my joy to hear him present and teach before, and I'm really eager now to hear him as he speaks on constitutional democracy and the rule of law. And what is at stake? What is at stake in the choice between the two major candidates and parties in this national election?
Tom, thank you very much, and thank all of you for coming out tonight. It's a delight to see so many people here. As Tom explained, this series is going to have a whole number of experts who are going to talk about specific issues. But my topic tonight is a bit more amorphous. When I was asked to give a title to the talk, I gave it the ostentatious title, Constitutional Democracy and the Rule of Law. That's a mouthful. Well, let me try to translate it for you into two more simple questions. So, the first is, if we take the various policy disagreements that Mr. Trump and those who favor him have, and compare those to the policy views of Mr. Biden and those who favor him, can we, if we do that, draw any larger notions about something bigger, about two very different competing visions of what the country should be, what it should be externally in its place in the world, and what it should be internally? That's the first question, and in some ways, the easiest. I think you'll find the comparisons are easy to draw, they're relatively straightforward, and we can probably extrapolate from them some general notion of the two competing visions, and I'll share those with you. But there's a second part to my talk tonight. Tom's invocation of Reverend William Sloane Coffin, who I knew because I was a football player at Yale when he was there for holier purposes. You know, when he said that we have more in common than we have that divides us, I think tonight's going to challenge us to ask, is that true? And so here's the second part of my talk, and I think the more challenging part of my talk. If we accept that November 5th may not be the day that matters, but the day that matters is November 6th, and the 4 years that follow it, think about this. No matter who wins, some 80 to 90 million voters would have voted for the other person. No matter who wins, about half the country will still believe in the things that we're going to talk about tonight. And so for me, the more interesting question, which I do want to explore after we do the contrasts, is it possible to envision a future in which somehow, some way, despite these stark contrasts, there is some sort of détente, some sort of denouement, some sort of struggling forward with some collective optimism? Well, that'll be the hard part of the talk, but when we get there, I'll have some ideas to share with you. So I'm going to first run through in some detail the contrasts. You're going to have other experts dig very deeply into these, but I don't think we can get our minds around the two different visions without some specificity, without some concreteness as to what each of the two candidates and those that follow them stand for. And so what I'm going to do is fairly quickly go through the comparison. And I'm going to go through the comparison first with regard to the place of the United States in the world. So first focusing on their two different visions of the role of this country vis-a-vis other nations. And then talk about their competing domestic visions. And when I talk about the domestic visions, I'm going to talk first about their economic notions, and secondly about their cultural and social notions. Now, I'm going to go back and forth, and I want to do this in sort of a fair way. So by prearrangement between Mr. Trump and Mr. Biden's camps, it's been agreed that they could trust a man of the cloth, Tom Kinder, to honestly call heads or tails. So you can see I have the coin. I'm going to let it drop.
Wait. Is that both?
You call.
Oh, heads.
Okay. Well, it's a tail.
Wait a minute, I want to see. Is it two tails?
It's just from your own wife, Tom. Come on. Here, take the coin back. Take the coin back. So Mr. Trump being the former president and Mr. Biden being the current president, Mr. Trump is the visitor, so he'll get to make the determination, and he has decided to go first on foreign policy and to defer to the second half kickoff on domestic policy. So let's talk about their two different visions of foreign policy. And I have labels for each of them. The label for Mr. Trump is transactional isolationism. And the label for Mr. Biden is traditional engagement. So what are the elements of Mr. Trump's vision of transactional isolationism? He believes that the United States should largely go it alone. We should, of course, make deals. He believes in the art of the deal, but these are generally one-on-one arrangements with other countries, and arrangements that have one major purpose, the economic advantage of the United States. He doesn't believe that it's the role of the United States to assist other nations economically. And he certainly doesn't believe that it's the role of the United States to propagate values, to try to spread to the world values of democracy or human rights. Militarily, he's very wary of military intervention, but more significantly, wary of traditional alliances, treaties that would obligate the United States to commit its forces. Most importantly, the NATO treaty, which obligates the United States to come to the defense of any other NATO signatory. He's been openly hostile to NATO, at least to the extent that he thinks other NATO nations are not paying their appropriate dues. They're getting more defense than they deserve, and that the United States is disproportionately called to pay for the expenses of NATO. He's generally very, very skittish about the notion that if there were a wider war in Europe, for example, that the United States should intervene. And to take specifically something like the conflict in Ukraine, it's fair to say that his notion is, really that's Ukraine's problem. That's Europe's problem. But there is, after all, an ocean separating us from Europe. And it ought not be our duty to waste our treasure on the defense of European nations. Let's contrast that with Mr. Biden's view, which I've already talked about as the view of traditional engagement. He believes that strong alliances are essential. These include bilateral alliances with individual countries and collective alliances such as NATO. He's honest in saying that the alliances are of two different kinds. Some are value-based. Some are alliances that are grounded in the notion, we believe the same things that you believe in. You're democracies. You're countries that respect the international order. You respect the rule of law. And because we believe in those things, we want to be aligned with you. But he's also a pragmatist, and he's willing to have what he calls practical alliances with nations that we may not admire for their human rights records or for their democratic qualities, but that we think are somehow strategically important, either to our national security or to stability in a region. The alliances with Saudi Arabia, for example, would be a prime example. He believes that the United States should be engaged actively in international affairs, not an isolationist nation, and that we should be willing to do what we need to do to repel aggression, to certainly send money and aid, for example, of Ukraine's defense, but if necessary, to send troops. He has not ruled out that if China were to invade Taiwan, it might be necessary for the United States to bring military aid to Taiwan, either in the form of material and money or potentially in the form of some sort of military engagement. He thinks that all of this is not only in the interest of the country, but essential to the country's identity. So in summing up this, let me take advantage of the recent 80th anniversary of the D-Day invasion at Normandy. For Mr. Trump and many of his advisors in international matters, the mindset of World War II, the mindset that celebrates the invasion of Normandy, is now obsolete and naive. And for Mr. Biden and many of the advisors in international matters that help him, the mindset of World War II, the mindset that celebrates the Normandy invasion, is as important today as ever. So let's now turn to domestic matters. And Mr. Biden's team will have the chance to go first. I think here, at least when I talk about the economic side, I'll go back and forth a bit. Then when I talk about the cultural side, I'll do all of one and all of the other. So this doesn't cover every issue of the economy by any means. We don't have the time. But in terms of the general mindset of the two competing candidates, Mr. Biden is generally more a believer in federal intervention and federal policy dictating matters than state and local entities. Mr. Trump is the opposite. He believes power should be not in the federal government, but generally delegated to states and localities. Mr. Biden and his party are far more of the view that economic distribution is an important social value. They believe in higher corporate taxes, higher income taxes, and the redistribution of wealth to level the classes of wealth in the United States. Mr. Trump could not be more opposite. He believes in a free market economy, a laissez-faire economy. He believes that taxes should be lower for everyone, but particularly for corporations. He's not a believer at all in income redistribution. Mr. Biden is generally more supportive of what we often think of as the safety net, the plethora of programs that exist to make sure that people disadvantaged for various reasons have some level of security. Well, he's more supportive of programs that provide food or education or health care or shelter to persons of less means. Mr. Trump is generally of the view that those programs are wrong-headed and should be curtailed, reduced, sometimes done away with altogether. So the sorts of safety net programs that provide things like food stamps or other forms of assistance, he'd be quite content to see cut back upon or even conceivably eliminated. Mr. Biden is generally a believer in the expertise of federal agencies and a believer that the federal administrative state does the nation far more good than harm and has been a center of many of our most progressive and innovative social policies. Mr. Trump could not be more the opposite. He would like to see many federal agencies dismantled. He thinks that they burden the nation with bureaucracy and regulation. Whereas Mr. Biden celebrates the administrative state for its progressive influence on the nation, Mr. Trump thinks the administrative state is a force of evil and therefore gives it the pejorative phrase, the deep state. Generally, the policies of Mr. Biden are very attentive to the evils of climate change and very attentive to reinforcing laws that are designed to protect the environment. Mr. Trump, not so much, doesn't treat it as a priority and would be willing and has and did during his years do what he could to diminish the power of environmental protection laws. So now let's get to the most fun part. I shouldn't say fun, but the most passionate part of the domestic comparison. And I'll first kind of describe Mr. Biden's views on social and cultural matters, and then describe Mr. Trump's views. Overall, Mr. Biden is generally inclusive and inclined to try to diffuse division. Overall, Mr. Trump is generally exclusive and inclined to incite division. So more specifically, for Mr. Biden, on matters of race, he believes in affirmative action. He accepts the notion that America has always been plagued by systemic racism. He promotes diversity, equity, and inclusion in all of its manifestations. On matters related to gender and sexuality, he is a supporter of LGBTQ plus rights. He's a supporter of the protection of people who choose to transition to different gender identities. If you will remember with me one of the great lines from William Faulkner's classic novel, Absalom, Absalom, you could say of Joe Biden, I am all polymath love's androgynous advocate. He is. And if you could write like that, you'd win the Nobel Prize. Mr. Biden is supportive. His Justice Department just today wrote a brief that the Supreme Court accepted of things like affirming therapy for people undergoing gender transition, including young people. And very, very significantly, on immigration, he accepts that comprehensive immigration reform is desirable. He's generally of the view that immigration should be encouraged, and generally of the view that we should look for pathways for people to citizenship for those that have entered the United States without the proper documentation. And finally, and most prominently, as I'm sure we'll see on the debate stage soon, Mr. Biden is a believer of the reproductive rights that emanated from the famous decision in Roe v. Wade. And he is against efforts to reduce the protection of reproductive rights in the aftermath of the Dobbs decision, and is in favor of doing what he can at the federal level to guarantee reproductive rights. Mr. Trump's views on every single one of these issues is exactly the opposite. He often embraces what I'm going to talk to you about as the anti-woke position. And I'll get into the meaning of woke and where that weird word came from and how it's been appropriated in recent years in my second half of my talk. But what I will call the woke wars are essentially the counterpoint to everything I've just described with regard to Mr. Biden's positions. So Mr. Trump is against affirmative action. And though he boasts that he brought to the Supreme Court the court that overruled Roe v. Wade, it's also the court that overruled decades of precedent allowing affirmative action in, for example, American universities. He doesn't believe in the notion that the country is plagued by systemic racism. You may remember the famous moment after the murder of George Floyd, when there was disruption across the United States, when he walked from the White House onto that beautiful church across the street from the White House. It's now called Black Lives Matter Plaza, and held up the Bible sort of in defiance of the protests that were going on. He's generally unsympathetic to notions of diversity, equity, and inclusion, has among his allies many of the forces that seek to banish those programs from the United States. He's no champion of the advancement of LGBTQ plus rights. You may remember by executive order, he banned transgender persons from the United States military. Like many of his allies, he's either openly hostile to such rights or at best ambivalent about them. And certainly his Justice Department would not be the champion for those rights that Mr. Biden's Justice Department would be. On immigration, we have perhaps the most profound contrast. President Trump is generally hostile to any form of immigration, generally suspicious of it, particularly from countries in which the immigrants are here because of economic stress or instability in their home nations. He's made pejorative references to those countries. You will remember he believed very deeply in building a wall on the border with Mexico. He issued as one of his first acts as president the immigration ban that he had described as an anti-Muslim ban. He later gave it a more antiseptic label, and it was ultimately approved by the Supreme Court of the United States. And he's made a great deal of fanfare, and his supporters have made a great deal of fanfare. In fact, there's already a blueprint, there's already a document that perhaps on his very first day as president, certainly in those very first 1 or 2 or 3 days, he would use the forces of the United States, including perhaps National Guard troops, to round up and place in internment camps people that are not legally in the United States, and to engage in mass deportations. So you couldn't have a stronger contrast. And finally, as to reproductive rights, you know that he is very proud that he was able to appoint the 3 Supreme Court justices who comprise the 6-3 majority in the Dobbs decision. And we've come to say, you'll hear throughout the next 3 or 4 days, Mr. Trump overruled Roe v. Wade. Of course, not literally, the Supreme Court of the United States did, but he appointed the justices who did that, and he's very proud of that. He's said with regard to what should happen after Roe, leave it to the states. And leaving it to the states can mean extremely draconian regulations restricting reproductive rights. And so there you have it. There you have the specific contrasts. And I think it's fair, I think it's objectively fair to say that here are the taglines for the 2 different nations. Mr. Biden envisions a nation that is engaged and inclusive, and Mr. Trump a nation that is isolated and exclusive. And you can see in a way the link, particularly in Mr. Biden's views, and well, in Mr. Trump's views, between the foreign policy views he has, let's isolate ourselves, and his immigration views, and let's not let anybody in. So now, the harder question, the deeper question. If these are the 2 competing visions, what will happen on Election Day? Will it be that the country will have chosen which of these 2 visions will be our future? And I think the right answer is not exactly. Not exactly. Because as I've already said, if you count the votes, 80 or 90 people will be on each side. And indeed, under our electoral college system, it is not unusual for the person who gets to the presidency to not have won the highest number of popular votes. So it's quite possible, let's imagine, that whichever candidate wins, that candidate didn't even command a majority of voters nationwide, or it was perilously close. So winning the Electoral College is not winning the heart and soul of the nation. So I'm going to use a phrase that resonates throughout world history and literature to challenge you then, and here's the phrase: what then shall we do? Now that phrase, what then shall we do, has some biblical reference. I think in Luke, the crowd puts it to John the Baptist. But its most famous reference, I see my wife Anya Smolla here, who's from Russia, comes from Leo Tolstoy, who wrote a book. What then shall we do? How would you say it in Russian? Say it real loud. Okay. And he wrote that dealing with squalid social conditions in Moscow in the 19th century. My favorite incantation of the phrase comes from one of my favorite movies. If you haven't seen it, I highly commend it. A great, great movie called The Year of Living Dangerously. The Year of Living Dangerously won many Academy Awards. It's set in Indonesia at the time of great social unrest in Indonesia under the brutal rule of President Sukarno. And the lead male in the movie is a journalist, played by the actor Mel Gibson. And then he interacts with two women prominently in the movie, Sigourney Weaver and Linda Hunt. And Linda Hunt plays the kind of haunting conscience in the movie. And toward the end, there is a scene, it's no big spoiler alert, you still watch the movie. Toward the end, there is a scene where Mel Gibson has seen so much corruption, so much destitution, so much violence. He's depressed. And it's like, what good am I writing about this stuff? And he's walking next to Linda Hunt. And she says, well, you know, Tolstoy asked this question. What then shall we do? And she suggests, I'm not sure Tolstoy got the right answer. He was so overwhelmed by all these big issues that were facing Russia, as you're overwhelmed. And here's what she says. Here's the line. You don't need to think about the major issues. You do whatever you can about the misery in front of you. Add your light to the sum of light. Beautiful. So in this part of my talk, I'm going to try to add my own little small light. So this little light of mine, let it shine, is going to talk about the woke wars. And I'm going to talk about them in a way that challenges you to be, as I am, guardedly optimistic. Now you got to make sure I warn you here. When I say optimistic, I don't mean optimistic that my preferred candidate will win. It's supposed to be nonpartisan. I mean optimistic that somehow, whichever side wins, the nation will find a way forward with some measure of compromise, some measure of reconciliation, some measure of respectful detente or denouement, despite our apparently irreconcilable differences. To capture this contrast between optimism and pessimism, I'm going to do something that is journalistically perhaps unethical. I'm going to use material that, in my view, was unethically acquired. So you may remember the buzz about a week ago when an undercover reporter posing as a conservative activist journalist, but in reality a progressive liberal journalist, managed to get tickets to the Supreme Court Historical Society Gala. My wife and I have been to a gala like that at the Supreme Court. It's very, very sophisticated, very classy. And she walked up to Justice Samuel Alito and began to chat him up. And then she walked up to Chief Justice John Roberts and began to chat him up. They didn't know they were being secretly recorded. So Mr. Justice Alito said a lot of revealing things. And a lot of those revealing things got headlines. But here was the part that to me was, in a way, the most heartbreaking. Because she asked him about the polarization in the country. And here's his answer. I know I'm quoting from an illegally intercepted communication here, but it's been in every newspaper in the United States. It's in the public record now. Here's his answer. One side or the other is going to win. I don't know. I mean, there can be a way of working, a way of living together peacefully, but it's difficult, you know, because there are differences on fundamental things that really can't be compromised. They really can't be compromised. So it's not like you're going to split the difference. A candid view, but not a very hopeful one. She then also cornered Chief Justice John Roberts, who I've argued in front of and have deep respect for, to be honest, and don't usually agree with his position. Sometimes I do. He gave a remarkably different answer. He did not think the polarization in the United States would doom the future of the country. And he pointed to the resilience of the country and how we have come somehow through other deeply, deeply divisive times. The most divisive, of course, the Civil War, but also the deep divisions that plagued the country during the Vietnam War and the aftermath of Vietnam. So in that spirit, let me make the argument that the Chief Justice had it right. That kind of guarded optimism that somehow we can make it is justified. And let me try to explain to you, as I sort of wrap this up and then invite your questions, where my own guarded optimism is coming from. So, I told you I'd talk more about woke. Where in the world did that goofy word come from? What the heck is this woke stuff? It's been appropriated by the cultural right and the political right. And really its biggest appropriator was Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, who ran against Donald Trump. But his campaign slogan was to do away with woke, and he governs Florida largely as an anti-woke state. And a lot of the specifics of that are what I've already talked about. In Florida, they have banned funding of DEI in Florida public schools and universities. They have banned the teaching of certain views of the history of the country that I'll talk about. But actually, woke is a word that has progressive roots. It comes from the American folk music tradition. It comes from one of the greatest American folk writers and musicians of all time, Hughie Ledbetter, often known by his musical name, Leadbelly. And you know many Leadbelly songs. You may not think you do, but you do. I know my kids do because they had to listen to me singing them at night when they were going to bed. So you know Bring Me a Little Water, Sylvie. You know Irene, Good Night. You know The Midnight Special. You know Cotton Fields Back Home. Leadbelly also was one of the first great protest writers. And a lot of his songs had a hard protest edge. He wrote a song called Mr. Hitler. And Mr. Hitler has lyrics, we're going to tear Hitler down, we're going to tear Hitler down, we're going to tear, we're going to tear, we're going to tear Hitler down. He wrote a song, a very biting, very bitter song, about the sinking of the Titanic in response to a famous story. The African-American boxer who was really the person who broke the color barrier in boxing, Jack Johnson, wanted to travel from London back to the United States. But the Titanic wouldn't give him a ticket because he was black. And a great song written by Leadbelly is, they wouldn't let Jack Johnson on board. They say this ship don't haul no coal. Fare thee well, Titanic, fare thee well. A hard edge. Well, where did woke come from? Leadbelly also wrote a song about the Scottsboro Boys. You may or may not know your American history, but the Scottsboro Boys were one of these first terrible, horrible episodes in which black males were wrongly accused of sexual assault against white women. 9 boys who boarded, 9 teenagers who boarded a train in Chattanooga, Tennessee, ultimately charged and convicted of rape by all white juries. And Leadbelly wrote a song called The Scottsboro Boys. And these were the early days of radio in which a person like Leadbelly would be interviewed. And the interviewer, kind of like our version of NPR, said, tell me more about that song. And tell me more about what you mean. And he said, my view was when you're traveling in the South and you're black, best stay woke. Keep your eyes open. And that's how it became a kind of anthem for progressive causes. So now here we are in 2024, 80 years after that song was written. And I've told you about the anti-woke legislation, but here's the piece of it that I think is the most revealing. It is that in those that embrace this movement, the teaching of the sadder, more tragic, unjust pieces of American history has been banished from our schools. Florida has a law prohibiting Florida university professors or Florida public teachers from talking about things like the history of racism, the history of slavery, the notion that there are those who believe that the country has systemic racism. You can't portray America's past as a racist past in the state of Florida. And this makes good sense. It makes good sense if you're on that side. Because if the narrative that describes the country is the country was born in original sin, the original sin of slavery, the country was steeped in racism, in class oppression, in oppression of the poor, in oppression of labor. If that's your notion of the country, then you have a lot of leverage in arguing for things like the redistribution of income, affirmative action, LGBTQ rights. So it helps to control the narrative and make it look like that's not part of the country. And so what you have in these woke wars is one side yelling, you're a country of racists, sexists, and homophobes. And the other side yelling, no, we're not, no, we're not, no, we're not. But I have a suggestion for you, and I'll end with this. It's a more complex narrative about how to interpret the history of the country, and maybe one that will make you at least slightly open to guarded optimism about the future. I have two distinctions I want to make. Some of you have heard me make these before. 2 dichotomies. They're very close. The first is a distinction between the composer and the composition. And the second is a distinction, another maybe same way of phrasing the same thought, between a conception and a concept. So let me first talk about composers and compositions. I think it's often important to separate the life of the composer from the composition that emerges. In this beautiful place, we hear the music of one of the great musicians in the area, Annemieke McLean, who loves to play Bach. Well, there are a lot of people that if you look into the personal life of Johann Sebastian Bach, would not find him a particularly admirable person on a human level. But that doesn't mean that you can't still appreciate the complexity and beauty of his compositions. Closer to home, maybe harder to take, Francis Scott Key was not an admirable guy. He was a slave owner. He openly prosecuted people on the Underground Railroad. He promoted his family member, Chief Justice Taney, to be the Chief Justice that wrote the Dred Scott decision. So there's not a lot to admire about Francis Scott Key, but does it mean that you can't still get goosebumps sometimes when you sing the national anthem? I don't think you have to always associate the composition with the composer. But in a more significant way, the most striking example, I think, is Thomas Jefferson. Because here we have another slave owner. Here we have a person who now we know in his personal life did many things that are far from admirable. But should that prevent us from still feeling the resonance of his most famous composition? We hold these truths to be self-evident, that men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among them are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now let me give you the second distinction. It's almost identical between the conception and the concept. Our history, this country's history, is filled with very powerful declarations of liberty and justice. Yet very, very often, the people who conceived of those beautiful declarations did not understand, did not appreciate their meaning in their own times. And so, for example, in the aftermath of the Civil War, the 13th and 14th and 15th Amendments were brought in as part of our Constitution, the famous Civil War Amendments, abolishing slavery, guaranteeing equal protection, abolishing racism in voting. And the core is the Equal Protection Clause in the 14th Amendment. But those who wrote that clause and those who ratified it never conceived that it could ever mean that women would have rights, rights to vote or rights to practice law. They could not conceive that the 14th Amendment meant that white people and black people could not be segregated, thereby stamping people of color with a badge of inferiority, forcing them to attend separate schools, ride in separate train cars, swim in separate swimming pools, or drink in separate water fountains. Yet eventually the concept of equality they adopted and understood by a next generation of people realized that equality had to extend to all of those different forms of identity, and that separate but equal was inherently unequal. Or a more recent example, I talked about it about a year ago right here in a program we had. Those who passed the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which includes a famous provision prohibiting discrimination on account of sex. Those who passed that law in 1964 never dreamed it meant sexual equality. They never dreamed it should be invoked in the aid of LGBTQ plus rights. Yet, the concept that they created, the concept, not what they were thinking, but the ideal they created, ultimately did come to be understood and recognized by the Supreme Court as embracing protection for those groups as well. In fact, it was a conservative Supreme Court justice, the first Supreme Court justice appointed by President Trump, Neil Gorsuch, who wrote a very powerful opinion saying that any discrimination against a gay person, against a lesbian person, against a transgender person was automatically sex discrimination. And he admitted, I know the people who passed the Civil Rights Act of 1964 never thought I would say this, but they didn't understand that was the implication of what they passed. So, if you believe in the power of ideas, if you believe that this country was formed by ideas and ideals, I want you to have some faith. I want you to have some faith that over the long haul of history, with fits and starts and backward steps and sideward steps, things generally move in a positive direction. in the words of Amazing Grace, written by a slave trader, I once was blind, but now I see. Abraham Lincoln preached in biblical allusions that a house divided cannot stand. And plainly today, we're a house divided. Yet somehow I do believe, deep in my heart, I do believe that we shall overcome. And that somehow the opposing sides will find some ways to work together, to promote the general welfare, secure the blessings of liberty for ourselves and our posterity. Whichever side wins, the ideas won't die. And whichever side wins, the songs of Hughie Ledbetter will continue to be sung. Thanks for listening. And now I think the floor is open for questions, concerns, and observations.
One of the issues that keeps coming up daily is truth. And one of my admired mentors, Buckminster Fuller, said, the only ethic is integrity. The universe, the nature, these wonderful birds we have at our feeder, everything runs exactly as it should. There are no falsehoods in the natural world, which is why it works so well. So Bucky used to say, integrity is the essence of everything successful. How do we dance with this environment of falsehoods and misdirections and misinformation?
It's a great question. So, one of my favorite quotes is from Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who said, everyone is entitled to their own opinions, but everyone is not entitled to their own facts. And we live in a world in which there's often what I would call ideological fact. People just will say it is fact because they've heard it so often, and they want to believe it so deeply. That was called the big lie after the claim that Mr. Trump won the election because it was stolen from him. This is treacherous business, but you know, the original phrase, the big lie, comes from Mein Kampf and comes from the propaganda of the Nazis during the time, and it was appropriated. I'm not completely pessimistic. One place that there is a shot for truth, I'm a lawyer, is I still have a lot of faith in our justice system. I have a lot of faith in our courts. And I happen to have been the lawyer that argued the case against Fox News for Dominion voting, in which one of our themes was, there's still right and wrong, there's still truth and falsehood in a court of law. Judges can adjudicate truth, juries can find truth. And I believe that's with us forever. I know there's a lot of legal peril. I know there's 4 cases involving Mr. Trump. I know a lot of people have low levels of trust, but I generally have a reasonable level of confidence in the integrity. So that's one place where truth gets adjudicated. Of course, the problem is those cases are often 4 or 5 years after an event, after an election. We'll watch a debate on Thursday night in which 2 very seasoned, respected, and I think reasonably moderate journalists will be the interlocutors. Jake Tapper and Donna Bash from CNN. And they'll be fact checkers. So we'll be able to watch and people will say, this didn't happen, this did happen. That's a little bit of a stretch. What bothers me, and I'm going to end here, what scares me more than the lies is the credulity of certain people to just accept them and to accept them in an uncritical way. There are a lot of things in which reasonable people can disagree on. A lot of factual things, a lot of scientific things, a lot of political things, a lot of moral things. But you can't run a society without some notion that the society has an ability to discern truth from falsehood. And I share the scariness of the fact that we may be in a place where some of those that we want to be able to reach out to and befriend and work with seem blind to that at times. But I once was blind, and now I see. Faith springs eternal.
Thanks.
Thank you. Yes. Thank you very much. That was great. Is it going to be harder to have this period of reconciliation and rapprochement, that even if it's partial, is it going to be possible to have that if the winning party has an agenda of retribution?
It's not going to help. It's not going to help. It's not going to help. Of course it's not. And let's look at the long view of history. You know, there have been other examples of this. One of the famous examples that came from places closer to Herbert's part of the world, when the Soviet Union fell and Czechoslovakia was split, and you had the Czech Republic and you had Slovakia, and Václav Havel became the president of the Czech Republic. One of the great questions was what to do with the collaborators, what to do with those that had supported the oppressive government. Should there be retribution? And he fought against retribution generally, and it probably helped heal the country. Had he fought the other way, you end up with a cycle. You end up with what's good for the goose is good for the gander. And so it clearly will be harder. And I guess that's a little bit of a pessimistic answer. One other thing to think about, Gus, is, we do have some checks and balances. I still have some faith in the judiciary. And we often end up with divided government. It's not that common that one party controls both houses of Congress and the presidency. It happens less often, actually, than it happens. Sometimes it happens for one term of a president's term of office, and then one or both of the other houses split. And that imposes a kind of pragmatic need to somehow figure out a way to deal with each other. I know we've come several times in the last few years to the brink of federal government shuts down because the party can't do it. But there are episodes in which that happens. And I guess another interesting question for me is, the torch gets passed to a new generation of Americans. You may remember that from John Kennedy's inaugural address. And the torch is being passed to a lot of folks younger than many of us in this room, not everybody. And a lot will depend on how they decide they want to live with each other and talk to each other and govern, even though they likely have some different views. So the answer is yes, but you still can't depress me.
Thank you. Would a paraphrasing of your view be that the founders had it right?
In our system of divided government, in our structure, etc.?
Yeah, the whole thing. Like, they did a good job setting it up so it'll work properly? Was that the basis of it?
The answer is generally yes. I'm pretty much an apologist for the basic structure of the Constitution. Obviously, it had deep flaws. Slavery was a horrible flaw. There are things that they just overlooked or they didn't word perfectly. But it's a remarkably resilient system and a remarkably resilient document. And it has a lot of the most beautiful and cherished and powerful expressions of freedom and equality and dignity the world has ever seen. And I think it's part of the country's DNA. I really do. I think it's in us. And I know we divide. We've always been divided. I mean, not long after George Washington, you had the deep division between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, between the John Adams folks and the Jeffersonian folks. But maybe that kind of cockeyed optimism that you heard from the Chief Justice, it's a system that somehow, as James Madison said, helps us appeal to the better angels of our nature, at least gives us that possibility.
Well, Rod, I'd like to invite you to go back to the first portion of your talk, the compare
Sure.
and contrast, because relating to what you were just saying, about the approach of the two candidates and two parties to democracy and the rule of law.
Yeah.
If you could talk about those two things.
Yeah,
Just do a
you
quick-
know, it's interesting. I hate to get too far into it because it almost comes down, in a way, so one-sided. You know, President Biden said a couple days ago that no matter what the Supreme Court rules, likely this week, Wednesday, Thursday, or Friday, on the presidential immunity issue, he will respect it. He will respect the Supreme Court's decision. And can there be any doubt that if the Electoral College rewards the presidency to Donald Trump, that President Biden will enable a peaceful transition and probably even give Mr. Trump the Wi-Fi password in the White House? It will be a dignified, he won't be happy, but it will be a dignified transition. And sadly, it does seem that Mr. Trump doesn't feel a need as a president to show respect for the democratic institutions of society, to show respect for courts, to show respect for judges. You can disagree with a judge. Half the country, more than half the country, disagrees with the Supreme Court's decision in the Dobbs case. But that's different from attacking the judge as a person, describing he or she as corrupt, attacking their family, and so on. So I think there is a difference, and the difference is in one candidate you have someone who is a very traditional institutionalist. I mean, he loved the United States Senate. He taught at the last law school I taught at Delaware. He believes in constitutional law. He's a lawyer. He has respect for these very traditional institutions in our society. He was famous for being able to deal in a nonpartisan way with people on the other side of the aisle. One of his closest friends was John McCain. And you have a person on the other side who's just naturally a pugilist and doesn't have in his heart, it seems to me, the same sort of respect. He has said, Mr. Trump has said, he would not try to violate the Constitution and remain in the presidency after a second term. So you may or may not be able to accept him in his word, but he has said that he would do that. But I do think your question, you know, it's something I think most people can see for themselves. Yes, a few questions up front here.
Do you think, through the history of our country, can you come up with any situation that had these kinds of characteristics?
Well, I think so. I mean, the divisions in the lead up to the Civil War were worse than this. There were moments in Vietnam and the protests that sort of swept my generation during that period that were very deeply divisive. In the progressive area, the turn of the 19th century, the labor disputes, disputes over progressive legislation, things like, you know, very simple things like minimum wages and so on. So I do think it always seems like this is the worst of times. I think we've had a lot of worst of times and a lot of ugly times. You know, I mean, racism, anti-Semitism, homophobia in the most mean, violent ways have existed. It feels real bad right now. The division feels real bad right now. But I guess I'm kind of the view, it's been bad before. That doesn't mean we like it when it's bad. But I do think we have the tools to somehow get past it. And I was asked, do I think, about the structure of the Constitution? I'll tell you one I really like is 4-year terms, and you can only have 2. This too shall pass eventually. Whoever gets elected, it's the last time for that person. I think I saw another hand or two. Vin?
There are a couple of people who have said things on Zoom. So Anita Farney, I'm hoping I'm pronouncing that correctly, says, oh, sorry. Anita Farney, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, says, as an American living abroad, it's disturbing to see such a large part of the country accepting isolationist views, especially if one is aware of the influence that other countries, non-democratic ones, have worldwide. No man is an island, no country is an island. Your reaction?
Well, I completely agree with that, and it's no secret that many of the countries with whom we have alliances are afraid of what will happen if we have a president that doesn't believe in those. I'll say one other thing, Vin, which I'll tell you. This is a place where I have a little optimism, because there was a time when the Republican Party stood for isolationism and the Democrats stood for engagement. And in the Republican Party, the forces of isolationism lost, and many Republican presidents have shared the vision of Joe Biden as being actively engaged in international affairs, believing in alliances, and being a beacon for the world. Ronald Reagan thought of the United States as a city on a hill, reflecting Calvinist theology and a beacon to the world. So isolationism is not so deeply ingrained in the Republican Party DNA, and it probably, right now, if a majority of members of Congress were to take a truth serum and tell you what they really felt, they're for aiding Israel, they're for aiding Ukraine, they're for aiding Taiwan, they're for a relatively generous country. And they may be afraid to say those things out loud right now, but that doesn't mean the belief isn't there, and that doesn't believe it. I don't think we're going to become an isolationist nation. I really do not, whichever side wins.
And Glenn Wiley, which I know I'm pronouncing correctly, says, our system of government requires an informed, critical electorate. That precondition seems to be imperiled at the moment. How do we support critical thought and inquisitiveness in the electorate?
Well, it's another important observation. I think one of the things that we've seen happen is the proliferation of so many different channels of communication in which people care only about their own favorite channel. So I grew up in a primitive time, before cable, before satellite, before the internet. I grew up in Chicago. We had ABC, CBS. PBS wasn't even invented when I first came. They didn't have Sesame Street at first, and a few UHF channels that played the Cubs games, and everybody would watch the nightly news. Now, some people watched one network and some people watched the other network, but there was a collective moment in which most people kind of got a common font of information. And yes, there were different voices. The Wall Street Journal would have one position, the New York Times would have another position, but there was a kind of a common set of facts, and even if the opinions were different, there was at least some cross-dialogue. And now, the people that watch Fox only watch Fox, and the people that watch MSNBC only watch MSNBC. Not everybody. There are people that switch, and there are people that go back and forth, but it's an important observation. It's harder to build a community when you don't talk to each other. So listen, last question from Herbert.
Yeah, I am somewhat concerned about the future of our democracy, because democracy depends on the loser in an election to be willing to accept defeat. and if immediately the cry goes out, stop the steal,
Right.
and half the people believe it, and even people in Congress are willing, contrary to all evidence, to back this, I believe we are in deep trouble.
Well, listen, I share the worry, but you're not going to talk me out of being an optimist here at the very last question. Because let's think about it. Let's think about it. Yes, there was Stop the Steal. And yes, insurrectionists stormed the Capitol. But I'll just tell you a personal story. I've prided myself on being able to have close friends that are conservatives as well as liberals, and lawyers that are advisors on both sides. And a lawyer that is one of my oldest friends is very influential lawyer from Virginia, who was a kind of fixer lawyer. That is to say, he was a person who could help you think through problems. And he was friends with everybody in the state, in the legal community, as was I. I spent a lot of time in Virginia. And we had a common friend who was one of the most fierce conservative judicial intellectuals ever. A federal judge named Michael Ludig, who was close friends with people like Antonin Scalia and Ed Meese and the conservative intellectuals that now really dominate the Supreme Court of the United States. And my friend, whose name is Richard Cullen, was the lawyer, it turns out, the personal lawyer to Mike Pence, the vice president. And Mike Pence was under intense pressure to say that the Electoral College votes should not be honored, and I declare these votes valid and these votes invalid and make Donald Trump president. And Vice President Pence's lawyer was my friend Richard, who called our former mutual friend, Judge Ludig, who was now retired, but a very respected Federalist Society founder and judge. And Judge Ludig advised Vice President Pence and then said publicly, absolutely you do not have this power, and you'd be violating the Constitution if you did it. And give Mike Pence credit. He had the guts to do the right thing. So all I'm saying to you is, yeah, there was a Stop the Steal, and yeah, there was an attempted coup, but it failed. And there were enough people with enough resiliency, enough belief in the system, enough faith to do the right thing, that they stood up and called it as they saw it. I think it'll happen again. I know it might not. I know your own experience. As you grew up, you see the fragility of our institutions, and you see mass hysteria that can overwhelm a country. But I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful that events like this kind of help us collectively develop the mindset to make sure it doesn't happen. So I want to do two things. I want to thank you so much for coming. It's a hot summer night and you're here, and that's very admirable. And so I admire your interest in these things and your sincerity and your passion. And my wife Anya and I bought the house across the street, which used to be the Stone Soup Inn. And anytime you want to come debate these things, come on by, and you can sing some Leadbelly songs, and we can argue and fuss it out and enjoy camaraderie. But thanks, Tom, for the series, and thank you all for coming.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much. And thank you to everyone who made this event possible. And thank you to all of you who were here this evening and in any format. We hope that you will linger now for informal conversation over refreshments out on the front lawn. And we also hope that you will not only vote, but work for the nation and the world that you want to see. We hope that you will find a way to use your voice and get actively involved in the election right now, dedicating your time and your resources to the candidate or party that you feel will be more likely to lead in the direction that you desire. So, so much is at stake. in this historic moment. So thank you for all that you will do to be a part of it, including going out and having some refreshments and conversation. Thank you.